Peter, thank you very much. I promised myself that I wouldn't be the first person tonight to mention the B word. And thanks to Simon, I've managed to keep my promise. I can't promise not to mention it at all, but we'll see. And thank you, everybody, but particularly Catherine and Peter, for giving me such a warm welcome here tonight. I'm delighted to see so many people in this room on the evening of what has been a beautiful day, the first day of a new spring, particularly beautiful here in Rydale, I imagine. And I'm very honoured to be invited to join your deliberations on climate change. And I particularly want to congratulate Catherine and Peter for convening an evening like this, because I think that what we have here is much more than an interesting evening of discussion and debate. No society, no nation can move forward without a healthy national conversation. And today here in England, our national conversation, it seems to me, is breaking down. We're more divided as a country than we've ever been in my lifetime. Across the barriers that divide us, across the nation, between regions, within communities, even in families, we're losing the capacity, it seems to me, to listen respectfully to each other and to reflect deeply on what we hear. We're losing the capacity to feel compassion for each other, particularly if the other is somebody we think is different from ourselves in some way. And we're losing the capacity to use our voices. I was very touched by the way Graham introduced himself, because it touches on this. We're losing the capacity to use our voices to heal rather than to widen the divisions that afflict us at the moment. And it seems to me, because of all that, we're dangerously close as a nation to an unstoppable descent into a condition that would be too awful to contemplate. I've come here today from Newcastle, where, as Peter said, I'm looking after my mum, and every 2 or 3 weeks I zoom down the A19 and the A1 to visit my wife and son, and then zoom back again, because my own home is in West London. And there's always been something of a gulf between the home counties and the northeast. I guess certainly ever since William the Conqueror did his harrowing of the north, which I think is probably remembered here as well as it's remembered in Northumberland. But they really do now, the northeast and the home counties, feel like two completely different countries. That difference, that gulf, has never seemed wider. And we desperately need to rebuild our national conversation. And that won't start in Westminster. It won't even start in York or Northallerton or Thirsk. It won't start on the internet or on social media. It starts at gatherings like this. And that's why, for me, as a friend of this part of our beautiful part of our beautiful country, that's why, for me, it's a particular honour to be here today. And here in Rydale, you've already done as much as any community to contribute to the rebuilding of that conversation that we need to have. I last came here 2 years ago, rather than coming through. I came here to stop 2 years ago to testify to the North Yorkshire County Council, the stony-faced gentleman of the North Yorkshire County Council Planning Committee, against the proposal by Third Energy to frack for shale gas at Kirby Misperton. The Planning Committee, it seemed to me, were utterly indifferent, both to the overwhelming voice of this community, which they purport to represent, and to the facts of the case itself. And they gave a green light to Third Energy, and people said at that time that where Quadrilla had failed to force open the front door to fracking across the Pennines in In Lancashire, Third Energy were now pushing open the back door here in Rydale, and that was going to open the way to the industrialisation of large parts of our countryside through fracking. Well, this community got its head, took the time, made the effort to get its collective head around what fracking for shale gas would mean and what its footprint would be on the community and beyond. People from all walks of life, from wealthy landowners like Richard Storey and Nick Howard and Philip Tate, to professionals, to people in business, people trying to be busy every day running small businesses, but to mums and dads and sons and daughters from all walks of life. And you found a common language, you built a shared conversation, and out of that shared conversation, you built a sense of common purpose, and behind that common purpose, you mobilized. And you kept going, and by keeping going, you stopped Third Energy in its tracks. And before I get on to climate change, I just want to pay tribute, because I think that successful effort, it's not over yet, but that successful effort deserves far more recognition, national recognition, than it's so far had. There are far too many people to name them all, but perhaps I could just name one or two as my personal tribute to them, and starting with Peter and Sue Allen, who are my hosts on this visit, but Chris and Dagmar Pickles, and Adele Pickles, and Chris Redston, and Steve Mason, and Joe and Steve White. I think it was Joe who first made contact with me and persuaded me to get involved here, to Tim and Eddie Thornton, Jim Tucker, who I think is here this evening. It's somebody claiming to be Jim Tucker, just said hello to me anyway. David Davis, who may also be here, is also here. Friends of the Earth, Simon Bowens and Lee Coghill, many, many more. But by doing that, you did exactly what we need on a bigger scale to do, to rebuild that sense of common purpose, that sense of shared identity, and the shared conversation that will have to underpin it. It's not over yet, as I said. And I think that Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS are a far more formidable adversary than Third Energy and Quadrilla, and all those other speculative carpetbagging outfits that just want to grab and run, as it were. Jim Ratcliffe doesn't need to worry about nervous investors. He can pay for it himself. He's already suing the National Trust, demanding to drill in Sherwood Forest, and trying to roll back ancient rights with his over-enthusiastic use of super injunctions. He says he's patriotic, although for a patriot, he seems to have rather a lot of trouble signing the checks to pay his taxes that the rest of us pay. But actually the tide is turning now, and I think even Jim Ratcliffe can be stopped if we carry on. And the next thing to do in stopping Jim Ratcliffe is to give the warmest of warm welcomes in Rydale to Team INEOS when it pedals through here very shortly on the Tour de Yorkshire. And I have no doubt that you will do that. But tonight is about climate change, so I'd better get on to climate change before I go much further. But I can't not point out in passing that, of course, it makes no sense to build a national shale gas industry if you want to be serious about climate change at the same time. You can't go backwards and forwards at the same time. And it's quite ridiculous, risibly ridiculous, to claim, as our government does, that shale gas is part of a pathway to a low-carbon future. But climate change is an altogether bigger subject. So let's move on to that. And first, let me be very clear. I'm not here tonight to change anybody's mind, because only you can make up your minds, and if you want to, can change your minds on what you think about any existential question, including climate change. All I can do is tell you what I think and tell you what I feel and try to explain why I think and feel those things. And I have no other agenda than doing that. Peter kindly said my job was as a full-time care. I wouldn't really call it a job. It's more, if it's not abusing the word under a church roof, it's a calling really to look after your mum when she needs you. But that's what I do full-time. I don't speak for anybody else. I don't represent anybody else. I never have actually been. I wouldn't regard myself as a professional campaigner. So all I can do is take advantage as an individual private citizen of this platform that you've kindly given me tonight. Sometimes it takes a child to say what adults can't. And I have a very good friend, his name is Jamie, from Glasgow. Having grown up on Tyneside, Geordie really does hold no perils for me. I can understand pretty much everything that's said in that part of the world. But when I listen to Jamie, sometimes I really have to try hard to follow what he's trying to tell me. He's a remarkable person. It's people like Jamie that give me the inspiration and the hope that keep me going in these difficult times. And for a while, for several years, Jamie worked in the East End of Glasgow as a volunteer. And in the East End of Glasgow, parts of the East End of Glasgow, there are estates where the average male life expectancy is in the 50s, still in modern Britain, 21st century Britain today, life expectancy in the 50s. And there are also a lot of children who tend not to go to school in the daytime and are frightened of going home at night. And so they spend a lot of their time on the streets. If Glasgow were Rio or Mumbai, you'd call them street kids. And what Jamie did was to work with those children and to devise and run activities that would give those children some hope, give them a stake, a sense of self-worth, and hopefully help them find a way of climbing out of the darkness that many of them lived in. And one of the things Jamie did was to run little ad hoc discussion groups, open-air discussion groups about issues of common interest. And because Jamie would describe himself as a climate change activist, that's how I first got to know him. One of the issues that they sometimes discussed in those little groups was climate change. And one day, Jamie ran a group on climate change, and in the group, there was a small boy called Kelvin from a very troubled background, already a heavy smoker with a careworn face. But Kelvin was sharp as the knife that he carried in his jacket already at the age of 10. This was 8 or 9 years ago now. Kelvin didn't say very much that day, he just listened. But at the end of the discussion, he piped up, and he's the kind of person who don't say very much, but when they do say something, you pay attention. And what Kelvin said, after listening for half an hour, was, well, why don't we just stop burning fossil fuels? Why don't we just stop burning fossil fuels? Climate change is an existential threat to our civilization and to our way of life. If we fail to rise to the challenge that it sets us, we won't be able to maintain the conditions which many of us, particularly those of us who live in relatively prosperous countries, take for granted, for our security, for our prosperity, for our fulfillment, for the chance that we all desperately want to hand on to our children a better future than the one that we were looking at when we were their age. To deal with climate change, Kelvin was absolutely right. We have to stop burning coal, we have to stop burning oil, we have to stop burning gas. And we have to do that very quickly, within not much more than a generation, globally, certainly within less than within no more than a single investment cycle for most kinds of major infrastructure. Kelvin was dead right. Greta Thunberg and the hundreds of thousands of children who are coming out of their school classes week after week now are right. Sometimes it takes a child. We know what we need to do to deal with climate change. We also know how to do it. All the technology, all the infrastructure we need are either available now, being deployed now, or pretty close to deployment, and we know how to bring them to deployment. Governments, regulators, professional bodies, we have the policy, the knowledge and the policies to accelerate that deployment. When I was in government, I worked on a lot of those policies, and some of them have borne some fruit, and if we had put in place a higher level of ambition, they'd have borne more fruit more rapidly. And it's not only that we know what to do and how to do it, we also know, of course, we know that we can't afford not to do it, but we also know that the cost of doing it for any individual nation and for the world as a whole is an eminently affordable cost, probably over the whole endeavour, because that endeavour will lead us to using not only energy but all materials much less wastefully than we do now. Probably the overall cost will be negative, even though there would be some upfront investment. But the unit costs of all of the key technologies have fallen in the last few years far more rapidly than even the most optimistic commentators were saying they would 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. The market is beginning to price in the cost of climate risk, pushing up the cost of high carbon investment. That's why sovereign wealth funds, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, has just announced the next stage in its evolving plan to divest itself from high carbon assets. But there are plenty of other similar institutions, I think also the Church of England, moving in that direction. It's often contentious when it happens. It's happening too slowly, but it's overwhelming, it's unstoppable. And if any of you are involved in any of those conversations, please use your voices to accelerate that. But if it's so easy, why aren't we doing it? We have to look beyond the technology, the infrastructure, the economics, and the policy. This is about the energy system. And the energy system isn't part of our economy. The energy system is the foundation of our economy. That's what the Industrial Revolution was about. What is an economy? An economy is a mechanism by which we use knowledge and ideas to transform stuff powered by energy. Energy is right at the foundation. And so to deal with climate change, what we need to do is to dismantle the foundation of our economy and rebuild it in a new way. We need to transform. This is not about incremental change. This is about transformation, which I think will lead me fairly quickly to stray a bit into Simon's area that I'm sure he will say more about. But the trouble is, you don't have to be a Marxist to understand that it's right at the foundation of the economy that power really lies in most societies. And turkeys, on the whole, tend not to vote for Christmas. And incumbent powers with a vested interest in the status quo tend to be resistant to change, and especially resistant to transformational change. And indeed, in this case, those I don't just mean the oil and gas companies, I mean the whole system of social interaction that they're part of. Those of you who depend on income from pensions probably are aware that there is no single part of most pension portfolios larger than the dividends from oil and gas equities, for example. It's an entire system, and we're all in a way part of it, but it's a system with a great deal of inertia, and the people who control the gateways in that system become very skilled at resisting change. And the pattern is often the same. First of all, you deny that there's a problem. And when that becomes unsustainable, you play for time. You say, well, maybe there is a problem. We need to understand it a bit better. We need to get our heads around it a bit. And then after doing that for a while, and the pressure grows and grows and grows, you try saying, well, it's too late now. We just have to accept that this is going to happen. Because if we'd done it earlier, we might have got somewhere, but it's too late. And then the final refuge, and that's where I think we are at the moment, certainly in this country and in many others. The final refuge is what I call, has anybody read a wonderful book called The Leopard by Lampedusa, the Italian 19th century novelist? He has a character in there, a member of the Sicilian aristocracy, 18th century aristocracy, which is trying to resist the swirling forces of social change that are about to turn their society upside down. And Tancredi says, if we want things to stay the same around here, things are going to have to change. And that's what we're doing. It's the Tancredi gambit, you could call it. That's where we are. That's where we are now. And to get beyond that stage, we have to do something we've never really done before, or at least not successfully. Nick, I think, talks about this when he's talking. Somehow, we have to summon an intensity of mobilization that is much more familiar in wartime than it is in peacetime. And we'll have to sustain it over a long period. And heaven help us if we don't manage to do that without triggering the war that is normally what sustains it, the conflict that's normally what sustains it. That's why this is a difficult challenge. We have to believe that we can do it, but we don't know that we can do it. The only way really to find out is to make the effort and to keep trying. Climate change isn't really, once you start to look at it like that, it's not about what we need to do. It really isn't. Climate change is about who we are. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Maybe recognizing, maybe asking permission from Graham and Catherine and others who are more versed in those kind of public conversations. And I know this village hall isn't a church, but thanks to Catherine, perhaps it is okay to say that we're gathered here tonight under a church roof. Is that all right informally, Catherine? Under the roof of the church? Actually, for the price of one, I believe. Ampleforth, Oswald Kirk, Gilling East, where we are, and Stonegrave. So we're under 4 church roofs all at the same time. And the question climate change is posing to us is really the most difficult question that humanity has ever had posed to it since the serpent persuaded Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Because by the choice that Eve made, by eating that fruit, she made us accountable in the mythic origin myth that we have. She made us accountable for all our choices. By our choices that we make in this generation about climate change, we will say whether we accept being held to account for the consequences, all the consequences, for everybody, and for our single blessed earth of our choices, our accumulated choices about climate change. How we think about who we are is a very complicated subject with a long history. I hardly need say there are whole libraries full of dissertations of one kind or another on theology and religion, on philosophy, on anthropology, on psychology, on politics, and much more. But it seems to me there are really only two basic orientations that you have to choose between if you want to start building your own sense as an individual and as a community, building your own sense of who you are. We can define ourselves according to what makes us different, one from the other, one community from the other, by what divides us. Or we can define ourselves by what we have in common, a single species on a single blessed earth. We can define ourselves by what will heal those divisions. And in real life, of course, over history, both of those tendencies are always there, and sometimes one has the upper hand and sometimes the other has the upper hand. And if we define ourselves according to what divides us, what we find is that the politics of fear becomes stronger than the politics of hope. The politics of indifference, the politics of cruelty, becomes stronger than the politics of compassion. The Good Samaritans head for the hills and no longer give comfort to strangers in need, to the vulnerable, to the poor, to the excluded, because they're all the other to us, and we turn our backs on them. And so we decide by our will not to take responsibility for the choices, for the consequences that our choices have for other people and for our single blessed earth. And in that situation, the forces that pull societies apart inexorably start to overwhelm the forces that hold them together. If instead we define ourselves by what unites us, by what binds us, we accept responsibility for the consequences of our actions, all the consequences of our actions. We accept that today, in this incredibly this condition of unprecedented interdependence that we have built for ourselves, that has been a consequence of globalization, we accept that our destinies are so tightly intertwined that if we don't rise together, if we can't find a way of rising together, we will inevitably fall together. We accept that we are all part of a single creation, and that whole creation is each one of us, and we are an expression of it. Let me just take a topical example. This is a practical point, actually. While Greta Thunberg and the school children were on their latest strike from school, the no doubt equally stony-faced members of the Cumbria County Council Planning Committee were giving their unanimous approval to a plan to build the first new deep coal mine, the first new deep pit in Britain for several decades. What they were saying is, we are not prepared to, it's not that they didn't know about climate change, they'd had lots of presentations about climate change, lots of pressures on climate change. We only care about the benefits as we perceive them for our local community, benefits which probably will prove to be an illusion anyway. But we're not prepared to take responsibility for the wider consequences of this action. I think today in Britain, it seems to me, and not just in Britain either, the forces that are tending to pull our societies apart are getting stronger and stronger. And those that hold us together are, of course, not to be underestimated. They're still there. But they're in danger, if we're not careful, of being overwhelmed. We're in the right place here tonight under a church roof, and I should confess, I myself am not a member of any congregation, of any denomination. But But some of the people I most admire who are leading the kind of resurgence that I'm talking about are leaders of the church, and they're to be admired and emulated. People like Bishop Jones, who we're talking about, who lives literally a stone's throw away from here, the former Bishop of Liverpool, who again and again has used his voice and his Christian practice to give a voice to the voiceless and the marginalised and people who needed to be heard, most famously the Hillsborough families, more recently the Gosport Hospital bereaved. This is not separate from climate change. This really isn't separate from climate change. Climate change isn't in a box over here, somehow separate from all of the other wrongs that we need to address, problems that we need to address in our society. Are we going to define ourselves by what holds us together or by what divides us? We're in the right place under the roof of the church because, as I understand it, and Catherine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's central to Christian belief that everybody is equal before God. You're nodding. Got that right. Seems to me that climate change is telling us something pretty similar. Climate change affects everybody, sooner or later. Some sooner, some later, perhaps. When I was a diplomat, I didn't go to the South Sudan, but I went to many other places and found that climate change is much more real and more concrete and more destructive. Just to digress for a moment, we organized the first ever debate on climate change in the UN Security Council. President Bush the Younger was President of the United States at the time, and his people tried very hard to stop us doing it. They said, I was party to a phone call from the US Secretary of State, where she basically said that they didn't expect an ally like Britain to go against their instruction and insist on holding a debate on climate change in the UN Security Council. It was the biggest debate that the Security Council had ever seen, bigger than the famous debate about HIV a few years before. And I'll never forget a delegate from West Africa, senior diplomat, senior ambassador from West Africa, coming to me afterwards, thanking the UK for organising that debate with tears in his eyes, because he said that in his country, for many years already, climate change was making people insecure. In land that was getting drier, where there were people who grew crops and people who herded cattle, the people who herded cattle were buying Kalashnikovs and shooting the people who grew crops because there was no longer enough water to sustain both kinds of livelihood.
Literally exactly the same in South Sudan.
Yeah. This we need to take responsibility for. The County Council of Cumbria needs to take responsibility for. That is what Greta Thunberg and the children are telling us. That's what they're telling us. We're in the right place under a church roof. God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he them, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every other living thing that moveth upon the earth. I said I was not a member of any denomination. I don't know whether I'm a Christian or not. I don't repudiate Christianity. I think there is such wonderful treasure in Christianity, but I don't identify with verses 27 and 28 of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. Because if we want to face up to climate change, we can't claim dominion. We can't seek to subdue the fish of the sea or the fowl of the air or every living thing that moveth upon the face of the earth, or moveth on the earth. We have to accept that we're part of a whole that comprises every single human being and the whole of nature. And we have to accept that if we do harm to any single part of that whole, we do harm to ourselves. That's what climate change is telling us. We are all equal before God, if that's the lens through which you want to view it. There are many other ways of saying the same thing. If we want to face up to climate change, we cannot exclude anybody else, because there is no them. There is only us. We have to accept that there is no chosen people, because we're all chosen people. We have to accept that there is no promised land other than the single blessed earth that we all have to share together and look after together. That's what climate change is telling us. We're all equal before God. If we want to face up to climate change, we have to remember, it's not easy for a former civil servant to use this kind of language. I hope you understand that. We have to remember how to love, and not just to love who we want to love in the way we want to love them. We have to make the effort to see our world as if through the eyes of God, to love as God loves, to love our neighbour. That's another, loving your neighbour, I think, is fairly central to Christianity, and to love our blessed earth with a passion which it's difficult to express. And this is how it starts. This is how it starts in an old village hall in Rydale on a spring evening at the beginning of a new spring. This is how it starts, and where it goes, ladies and gentlemen, is entirely up to us. Thank you very much.